Welcome everybody to TTG's latest Business Support Live. I'm Jennifer Morris, the news editor at TTG, and today we're going to be discussing sort of travel regulations and insurance and the restrictions on travel, after the shock announcements about Spain over the weekend and the kind of resulting confusion that has caused. Today I've got a great panel. I'm joined by three guests. I've got Farina Razam, partner and travel lead at law firm Kemp Little, Sarah Brody, travel insurance policy advisor at the Association of British Insurers, and David Skillicorn, commercial director at Prestige Holidays. Welcome everybody.
Afternoon.
Hi.
Hello.
So I thought it'd be helpful to kick off really to ask you guys your thoughts on whether this U-turn, if you like, I know it's possibly a strong phrase, but the idea that the government can kind of permit travel to certain destinations and then take them off the FCO list and also the quarantine exemption list, is this now going to set a bit of a precedent, do you think? And should we expect many more destinations to be kind of to fall under that umbrella in the near future? David, I'm not sure if you want to kick us off on that one.
Well, on the face of it, I mean, we were told this was always a possibility. This was made very, very clear. None of us actually believed that was or could happen, when we felt that the direction of travel was no pun intended, was going in the right direction. This has caused a massive shock, the events of the weekend, over the weekend, and then made worse by the further tightening on Monday evening. I hope to God this doesn't become the new norm, because no one's going to commit themselves to anything. It will be fairly terminal, I'm afraid.
Okay. Would you agree with that, Farina, from your kind of being quite close to bonding issues and things like that? Is this something that you're expecting to see a lot more of?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's inevitable we'll see other destinations sort of taken off the exemption list. And I imagine that the reason that the FCO's done it this way, in terms of they've actually kept the blanket advisory in place, and then they've had a list of countries that are exempt from that advisory and from quarantine. And I think the reason they've probably done it in that way is because it's perhaps easier to change the names on that list than it is to actually change FCO advisories for different destinations. So maybe that's why they've done it, so it's a little bit easier to do, but I think it's inevitable we will see more countries taken off the list, put back onto the list.
And David, just quickly, as a sort of tour operator, how do you plan for this? Are you having to go through and kind of highlight destinations? Obviously, don't have to name names, but highlight destinations that you think are perhaps likely to have their advice changed. Is that something that you can prepare for, or are you just going to have to go with the flow and sort of do business as usual for the time being?
We take the best soundings we can, and this is what we've done over the last 18 weeks. For instance, Canada has been off the list, or rather is a no-go zone as far as we're concerned, and the whole season's been wiped out. We kind of felt nothing was going to actually change until August, so it was a surprise when things started to ramp up in July. I am aware that there could well be further changes to the list that is currently available. I'm not quite sure how we're going to be able to explain that to clients, because of course we then have the scenario where advice to citizens of other EU states travelling to the same destination is different to the advice being given out by the FCO. That gets thrown at me a lot. We're just going to have to manage the situation. Right now, we've taken a 14-day view on Spain, the Balearics and the Canaries. And we will continue probably to follow the pattern of the big tour operators, those who are controlling much of the air capacity. And so far, clients have been quite happy with that explanation. We have no panic. I suspect those we've got booked to travel in August are pretty resilient. They've had weeks and weeks to think about moving. They haven't. I think they're quite determined to go. I think they are resilient, and I think they'll take whatever we have to throw at them, or move them, or change them if we have to do that.
I was going to ask actually, what was the sort of reaction come Monday morning or Tuesday morning after the second update? You didn't see a sort of huge bulk of cancellations. It was more, you found quite a resilient pool of customers.
We braced ourselves for it. We pulled a number of people back off furlough to ensure that we could cope with what I felt was certain to be a barrage of calls. That barrage of calls just did not come. And we still have people booked to travel within the next 10, 12 days who we haven't heard from. So they're obviously quite happy in this scenario at the moment.
Okay, so perhaps customers are becoming a little bit more resilient in themselves and learning to kind of roll with the punches, for want of a better phrase.
Someone said to me that if you'd spent weeks and weeks and weeks in lockdown with all sorts of things you couldn't do, and you couldn't go out and you couldn't see your family and all the rest of it, your holiday in the sun is absolutely sacrosanct. So to get that, if that means you have to go into quarantine when you come back for 2 weeks, well, so be it. You've had your holiday. And there's a lot of evidence that people also feel they're actually safer abroad because there aren't the numbers. The beaches aren't packed. And I think that's what was bringing bookings in over the last 2 weeks, in small numbers, I hasten to add. But how we're going to cope if the scenery is changing unpredictably, I'm not sure.
Absolutely. And just very quickly, sorry, we will move on to the other panelists in a minute. David, I know that you said about sort of following slightly what the bigger operators are doing because they obviously control a lot of capacity. I know, for example, TUI has said that it won't actually take customers on holiday to anywhere that a quarantine, to anywhere where on return they're going to have to quarantine. So obviously they've kind of blanket cancelled Spain and things. Would you take the same approach as that, or can you be a bit more flexible?
No, we would be more flexible. I mean, as a small operator, we buy in air capacity from TUI, from Jet2, EasyJet, BA, and a number of others. So if the flights are still operating, if there isn't the famous warning against all but essential travel, but there is the possibility or the certainty of quarantining on arrival back, we would simply make sure the clients were aware of that. If they're happy to proceed. If they're not happy, well, then we have to look to move them to another destination or defer the departure.
Okay. Farina, as our legal expert, are you able to sort of outline a little bit about what the legal position is now? I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the two different lists. Anyone working in travel has had to, unfortunately, get their head around this kind of complicated picture. But if you could just spell out in sort of legal terms, that would be really helpful.
So as in travel to Spain?
Yeah, travel to Spain, and yeah, I suppose that's the only one at the moment.
Yeah. So if you go on the FCO website, you'll see that there remains a blanket advisory in place against non-essential international travel. And then obviously what the FCO have done is they've created this list of exemptions. Now that they've taken Spain off that list of exemptions, there's actually two issues that need considering. You've got the issue of there is now an FCO advisory in place against travel to Spain. And then you've got the issue of, and also you have to quarantine upon your return. So it's the fact, so it's actually the FCO advisory against travel that means that Spain holidays have to be cancelled and should be cancelled. If they didn't put the FCO advisory in place and it was just the quarantine upon return, so as similar to what David was just saying, well, you don't actually have to cancel the customer holiday. The customer doesn't have the right to cancel if they want to, because that does not affect the performance of the package holiday. It doesn't affect the performance of the customer's contracted travel services. But it's the fact that there's the FCO advisory in place as well, which means travel insurance is invalidated. There's an FCO advisory in place against travel, and so customers are entitled to cancel their holiday and receive a refund if they want.
I suppose one question is, if you were a travel agent and you had customers who basically are saying that they want to go regardless of the FCO advice, what would be your advice to them? I suppose there are, as we can come on to later, there are tailored insurance policies that you can take out that allow for FCO exemptions. Is there a kind of stock response you can give on that, or would it depend on who's asking?
Yeah, I mean, I have had that. I have had clients get in touch and they said, look, we've got customers that are adamant that they want to travel to a certain destination, even though there's an FCO advisory in place. What can we do? Can we let them travel? I guess ultimately, I mean, an FCO advisory doesn't make it illegal to travel. It's still perfectly legal to travel, but you would be traveling against FCO advice. What that does generally, it will invalidate the customer's travel insurance, but it might also affect the tour operator's own insurance as well. And this is something that has been mentioned to me in terms of you might end up sending a customer abroad without having your own public liability, tour operator's liability insurance to cover them for that travel because they've gone against FCO advice. So that is something that you would really need to check. And then, the other point is, you know, because the other question then is, can we get them to sign something? Can we get them to sign a disclaimer that says they're going to travel against FCA advice? But ultimately, you can't contract. Customers cannot contract, and you can't ask customers to contract out of their legal rights under the PTRs. You can't disclaim. You can't exclude your own liability for your own for any death or injury that happens over there as well under your, if it's due to your negligence. So you are ultimately sending customers on holiday, and there's a risk that you might end up with claims against you that you're not insured for. And you can't, you know, even if you've got the customer to sign up to something, you can't enforce that against the customer if it's not legal. So generally, I would say it's quite risky to send customers to a destination against FCA advisory, and I would generally advise against it. But if you do want to go ahead and do it, you have to check that your insurance, your own tour operator's liability insurance, does still cover you for that travel. And I would also insist that they get some kind of a policy that would still cover them, and they pay extra however much they have to, if there is travel insurance out there that would cover them.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, you mentioned briefly actually before the discussion about disclaimers, a few clients have perhaps inquired about whether it's worth asking customers to sign these. Would you, as you sort of touched upon there, it's not necessarily a solution.
Yeah, it comes down to what you put in the disclaimer, and I think the danger with disclaimers is people tend to go too far in terms of what they can exclude, and you know, you can't just say to customers you're traveling at your own risk and we're not going to have any liability, because the customer does have rights under things like the PTRs that cannot be contracted out of. And I think the danger with disclaimers, if they're not drafted properly, is you are potentially going to scare customers off for not any legal gain, because you ultimately can't enforce that disclaimer against them. So I'm not saying no to disclaimers. I think they do have a place. I wouldn't call them a disclaimer. I would call them an acknowledgement, of risk maybe. And they can be used, but they have to be very, very carefully drafted to make it clear that they are not excluding the customer's legal rights. And perhaps what is a better option would be to, around this sort of element of acknowledgement, would be to have things within your T's and C's as well that really explains what the holiday experience is going to be like, and sort of getting them to acknowledge that. So if that's wearing masks on flights, wearing masks in public places in the destination, that there might be restrictions on numbers, that kind of a thing would help as well. And actually, I drafted a model clause that I think ABTRA has made available to its members, and that basically outlines some of the legal situations that tour operators will not be liable for if a customer gets turned back because they fail a test, if a customer gets turned back because they refuse to put a mask on. They're like all the situations that you wouldn't expect tour operators to be liable within. And within that as well, I have also drafted some wording around managing expectations around what what a holiday experience will be like now, and the fact that we wouldn't expect those types of changes that are coming into force or are in force to have a significant impact on the customer's holiday and be considered a significant change. So if you are an ABTA member, it might be worth going and having a look at that and seeing if you can include that within your own T's and C's.
Interesting, thanks for that. Sarah, obviously it's been a very busy time indeed for the insurance industry as well as travel, especially travel insurance. I suppose a good question to start with, have insurers, what's the sort of landscape been looking like? Have insurers been seeing a huge, increase in inquiries of late in terms of wondering what's included in their policy? What's the sort of landscape looking like for insurers?
Yeah, I think you're right. Obviously, there has been a kind of significant increase in customers contacting claims hotlines and helplines across policy lines, whether it be, travel insurance, home insurance, business insurance, just people trying to get a better idea of how their policy works. And I think in regards to the Spain situation, you may have a consumer who booked their trip when FCO advice said it was safe to do so, and now FCO advice says it's not safe to travel there anymore. So what does this mean for them and their policy? So I think it's important in regards to travel insurance for consumers to check their policy wording and to check what they are covered for. A lot of it will depend on a variety of factors. When did they take out their travel insurance policy, or when did they renew it? When did they book their trip? because since COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, it's become more of a known event, and the likelihood of cancellation risk has greatly increased. So there might be some exclusions in travel insurance policies kind of from March onwards. That means that customers can't claim for cancellation costs as a result of COVID-19. So it's important for consumers, before they're booking trips overseas, to really make sure they know what they're covered for.
I mean, do you expect, obviously insurers, in the same way as travel companies, need to try and gain consumer confidence to sort of take out policies? Do you expect the kind of idea of pandemic cover to become a bit more of a norm going forward? Obviously, within this current crisis, where there could be second waves, but also going into, the coming years, we could unfortunately have on our hands another pandemic. Is that something that's going to become a bit more of a normal factor within travel insurance, do you think?
I can only speak for ABI travel members, travel insurance members, so I can't speak for every insurer, but I can say that the vast majority of ABI's members are still offering emergency medical cover for those travelling overseas, as long as they're travelling in line with FCO advice. So if you were overseas and contracted coronavirus and needed to go to the hospital, your travel insurance would still cover you. And I think that's really important, because at its essence, that is the purpose of travel insurance. It's an emergency medical product. And I think ABI travel insurance members, a lot of them have acknowledged that and are really trying to make sure their customers are protected in that sense when they travel overseas. I think probably where there's going to be some variety is in the cancellation space, as I've said, because of this coronavirus now being a known event, and more of a likelihood that trips might not go ahead. There may be some exclusions in that space. Obviously, insurers may consider kind of what kind of product offerings or add-ons they can offer in the future that cover some of the issues that have been raised by coronavirus. That will be a commercial decision kind of based on insurer by insurer to decide whether they want to offer kind of further or add-on cover for consumers to purchase.
Yeah, because I think as obviously Farina mentioned, of course it's not illegal to travel, but FCO advice, most people know, would then invalidate your travel insurance. However, obviously there's this nuance where we may have destinations that are still possible to travel to according to the FCO, but they do introduce a quarantine factor. So is it, I mean, presumably even within cancellation cover, which has become much more of a thing of late, hasn't it? Various travel companies and insurers have come out and announced COVID cover. But I don't think it tends to include cancellation if you just decide you don't want to cover any travel anymore because you don't want to quarantine. I think I'm right in saying that.
Yes.
Yeah. So is that something that perhaps might become a bit more of an add-on, a norm that people can opt to, have a more comprehensive COVID cancellation cover?
Yeah, you're completely right. So cancellation or travel disruption cover as part of your travel insurance policy isn't designed to cover a situation where you choose not to travel, but there's no FCO advice against travel. So it is unlikely that you would be able to get cancellation cover because you no longer want to travel because you have to self-isolate on your return when the FCO actually allows you to do that. What I would also stress that it's important is if it's only if FCO advice does allow you to travel, and it's only kind of the quarantine measure on return that's in place, your travel insurance still should be valid for your trip. So that should enable you, if you have a policy that gives you kind of that emergency medical cover I've discussed, you should still be able to go on your trip and use your travel insurance policy under the same terms as when you bought it, as long as you're not traveling against FCO advice and you didn't book the trip where there was no FCO advice. But I mean, I don't think there's likely to be kind of a situation where travel insurers start offering products where it provides cover for consumers where there is that FCO travel advice. against travel in place, because that's the government signalling it's not safe to travel to an area, and there is an obligation on insurers to act in the consumer's best interests. So it doesn't realistically make a lot of sense to offer cover in those circumstances. In terms of the quarantine, potentially cancellation cover for when the quarantine measure is in place, again, that might be something insurers look to at the future as an add-on or additional product.
Yeah, because I suppose the FCO advice, as we've said, it could change a lot going forward for various different destinations. And I think we got approached by one particular insurer actually that has always offered travel insurance products that allows for you to travel to places that are exempt from, that are advised against by the FCO. Presumably they're quite a lot more expensive on the whole, would they be? Because they're sort of designed for people, traveling to war zones and things like that. You don't expect that to become a bit more of a normal product at all going forward?
Obviously, anything could happen at this stage. This has kind of become something we've completely unexpected. But in my view, from my conversations with the ABI travel insurance members, I don't see travel insurance changing so that policies remain valid if you are travelling against FCO advice. Again, linking back into the interests of consumers. Obviously, there's exceptional circumstances like, you've discussed reporters going into war zones, but for everyday travellers, I can't envisage a change in that sense.
Okay. We actually have a question. Somebody's asking, what if a client's work situation wouldn't allow for a quarantine on return? Could they have cancellation cover then? I suppose that's for both Sarah and possibly Farina in terms of, sorry, I know you're not necessarily an employment expert, Farina, but in terms of, I don't know if you know much about the kind of obligations of employers, if somebody's now in Spain and they have to now self-isolate for 2 weeks. But Sarah first, perhaps, I don't know if you can comment on that one.
Sure. So obviously the quarantine kind of situation doesn't trigger your cancellation cover, but if there is a reason where your employment might be affected by your trip and having to come back in quarantine, then that's something you should speak to your insurer directly about and explain your individual circumstances. Insurers, given the extraordinary circumstances posed by COVID-19, are looking to be flexible where possible. So I would recommend speaking directly to the insurer.
Okay, great. And Farina, I don't know, is that something you are able to kind of comment on at all?
I can comment on the from the PTR perspective, which is because it doesn't affect performance of the package, we wouldn't expect it gives the right to cancel and receive a full refund. I do acknowledge that that's potentially unfair to those customers who cannot work from home. So I guess it's one of those things where if you are somebody who can work from home, yes, it's a pain to quarantine upon return, but you're not having to take 2 weeks off work. For those people who can't work from home, I do think that potentially you could say it's unfair. I mean, I've had I know that ABTA stands, and that's the stance that they've told the CMA, which is that they don't think that it gives the right to cancel. And I do agree with that because it doesn't affect the performance of the package. But the second point about the employment, I will check that point. I'll check that point and come back to you.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure there are some articles up around there floating around it, or we can, perhaps.
In fact, somebody did send an article. One of the employment team did send an article, and I'm regretting not reading it now.
Sorry,
I will forward that to you.
Okay, brilliant, and we'll share that on TTG as well, because I think that's quite a pertinent point actually for employers out there. Okay, I suppose, David, a question more generally is, how do you think things are looking at the moment? Are you, obviously up until before the weekend, we were looking at kind of this bounce back, green shoots. Just in terms of an industry perspective, are you still quite optimistic for the next few weeks? I mean, do you think this unfortunately does signal perhaps the steadying of the hopes of a return for the summer season? Or, I mean, people are traveling, people are away. I've been seeing all over my social media, people are still seem to be away in various places, Greece and elsewhere.
I think the concern is now 18 weeks in, and we're now virtually knocking on the door of August, which is going to be a difficult month, which leaves 8 weeks left of the summer season. There will come a point where, and I know a lot of hoteliers abroad have already decided, we've come this far, we're not going to open at all. It simply isn't worth it. It's not, particularly in the Balearics, places like that, and Croatia. For the Canaries, it's slightly different because, of course, this is their low season. They move into high season, and our winter revolves around the Canary Islands. So, like all people in the travel industry, we are super, super optimistic, and we have to be super optimistic, if only to keep our staff as optimistic as we are. I do think August is going to be a very difficult month, though, with an awful lot of stop-start going on. I hope, please God, once we get into September, for a little more stability, albeit a much smaller industry with a much smaller potential client base. Because, of course, I'm very mindful, by the time we get into October, we've got the end of furlough coming up. And that is going to throw up all sorts of horrors for the economy. And I'm afraid at the end of the day, we're selling a luxury item. We will be top of the list to be struck off that list.
TTG has actually today last night launched a Save Travel campaign, which
I've seen it.
Yeah, really do welcome everybody to sign that letter addressed to Grant Shapps, but also to Rishi Sunak, kind of acknowledging that they can't give us such small windows of warning for when they're going to update these, issue these advisories, because I suppose as a business it's just not practical, to be flexing it in this way. And just making a few demands. I think furlough is actually covered off in there as well, because as you said, we're sort of faced with this quite hard cut-off point, and we're entering winter, which is notoriously really difficult, obviously, for travel businesses. It's never, well, except for ski companies, the most kind of, affluent time of year. So, Srini, a little bit off on a tangent, but we discussed that it might be helpful to cover off quickly any operators, or I think it's just operators, not agents, who have received letters from the Competition and Markets Authority around legal action on refunds and cancellations. Is there any sort of update you can give us on that, or your kind of best advice there?
I think ultimately check whether it's the open letter to the travel industry, or check whether you've received one specifically just for you, because obviously the CMA have done an open letter for the travel industry, and then they have sent that to a number of tour operators that they've received complaints about, and the open letter doesn't really require you as a tour operator to respond. It doesn't ask for a response. It basically just outlines sort of the CMA's stance, and which is that they have received a lot of complaints around refunds, reminding, and also not just complaints about refunds, but complaints that customers are being misled as to what their refund rights are as well. And so they're just basically making those tour operators aware that some of those complaints have been about those particular tour operators. This is what the legal position is. Refunds should be made within 14 days. If you haven't made these refunds within 14 days, if you still have refunds outstanding, they need to be made promptly. So I think it's a little bit of a shot across the bows for the travel industry. Probably the CMA are probably sort of thinking we've given a few months now to get the situation sorted. If you haven't made your refunds yet, maybe you should start. And it is a tricky one. It is a tricky one, because I think what really needs to be had is a conversation between the CMA and a conversation between ABTA. Because what you'll get is a lot of tour operators saying, but we followed our trade body's guidance around refund credit notes, and I think what we could really do is knowing whether the CMA will accept that as a response, and whether that will stop the CMA from pursuing any further enforcement action. I think that's what would be really interesting to hear right now.
Yeah, good point actually, because we did get that clarification recently on RCNs, but I suppose the very fact that they exist sort of slightly goes, like as you said, is not sort of in line
goes
with
against
goes
against the 14-day. I mean, I personally, I think maybe the CMA will give about a 6-month window to get these refunds out, and possibly if we get to the end of the 6 months and refunds still haven't been made, maybe the CMA might start trying to take a heavier stance and a heavier approach. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, but if you've got a CMA letter that is very specific to you and asks you to respond, then you should absolutely, I would say, get legal advice firstly, but also then you would need to respond to that because they've asked for a response. But in the open letter to the travel industry, they haven't asked for a response.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to my panelists. Unless there was anything else regarding insurance or legal requirements that you think that we should cover off, I think that's been a useful conversation. So thank you all for giving up your time today. Oh, David, were you going to say something? No.
No.
Oh, it looked like you were poised.
Thank you for inviting me along.
No problem. No, pleasure to have you all. And if anybody out there does have further questions or more specific questions, then do feel free to email me and I will try and get those answered for you. My email address is jmorris@tcgmedia.com.